After a brief lull in the fighting, the First Succession War once again flared up in December of 2807, when the Free Worlds League made their next step in their plan to rebuild the Bolan Thumb. Descending on Marsal were the two lead units of the Bolan defenders, who made short work of the Lyran garrison, claiming the world as their own by February. Realizing that they could not ignore the threat still lurking within the Commonwealth, Lyran High Command redeployed to deal with the Bolan remnants. In May, they countered with an assault on Radostov, liberating the planet once again after a 2-month campaign. 2808 is the point that some historians cite as the year when the First Succession War entered its second phase. By this stage, every successor state had exhausted their strategic reserves. Most of the shipyards and many of the battle mech factories lay in ruins. Warships and jump ships were extremely scarce. Even ammunition was becoming hard to come by. Conscription was in widespread use in every realm to try and maintain operational numbers. Wave after wave of new recruits were rushed through training, and the cadets being put onto the front lines were younger and younger. One realm that was feeling the hurt from 3 sides was the Capellan Confederation. The Federated Sons were riding the wave of momentum that swept a path forward, but also threatened to break and turn towards the Confederation. Since the disaster at Orient, the Free Worlds League had reclaimed all of the worlds the CCAF had only just liberated, and then dispatched their Marik militia alongside Smithson's Chinese bandits to grab Mozero. The best they could muster in retaliation was a raid on Nova Roma by the Chevaux Leger, and the two would battle on and off over the next 5 years for control of the planet Ibstock. Their only saving grace was that Thaddeus Marik remained much more interested in the Lyran Commonwealth than following through on his father's desire to crush House Liao. For the Chancellor, the most pressing concern was the sharp increase in action towards Terra. Their last attempt to retake Ronal in 2805 had failed. Since then, the Draconis Combine had been conducting a side campaign within the former hegemony. In time, they would take another 6 worlds from the Tikhonov commonality. It was with this threat looming that Chancellor Ilsa Liao made one of the most shocking decisions of the Succession Wars. In April 2808, Ilsa Liao renounced her claim to the First Lordship. Furthermore, she sent a messenger to First Prince Paul Davion and offered to back his candidacy. The condition for her support was simple: recognize Confederation ownership of the Chesterton worlds. To the ruling class of the Federated Sons, this incredible offer seemed almost too good to be true. First of all, a cessation of hostilities on the Capellan front would allow them to focus all their energies against the Draconis Combine in the upcoming second offensive Paul was planning. It came at the cost of Chesterton and its subsidiaries, but the truth of the matter was that they were almost all in Confederation hands already and would take considerable effort to win back. But perhaps even more significant, with Davion and Liao aligned behind the First Prince, all it would take is to win the support of a party neutral to both of them, i.e. the Lyran Commonwealth, to have a voting majority among the former members of the Star League High Council. In June, the Chancellor received Paul's response. The First Prince dispatched the Crucis Lancers to take Ulaanbaatar and then Farwell 2 months later. His rejection shocked the nobility of both realms and threatened to undermine his newfound popularity at home. Pundits at the time lambasted his arrogance, but the Davion Lord might have realized something that his contemporaries did not, save perhaps Ilsa Liao herself. The Succession Wars were and are a farce. The Star League, if it even still existed at the commencement of the hostilities, had long since faded into memory. The Terran hegemony was gone too. There were only the successor states left, and there was no higher authority that any of the House Lords would recognize anymore. Ilsa's offer to name him First Lord was hollow, an appeal only to vanity, and the price was to sacrifice systems that had belonged to the Federated Sons for over 400 years. As 2808 drew to a close, the AFFS was getting ready to launch their second counteroffensive. The goal was twofold. The primary objective was to drive the DCMS out of the Crucis March altogether, while secondary assaults took aim at the extreme flanks of the Draconis march. Troops were assembled on Castleton and Rowe, launching their attack in the first 3 months of 2809. Nearby, the Crucis Lancers succeeded in capturing Farwell and Ulaanbaatar that March. The Castleton task force showed early success, taking the planets Johnsondale and Olancha by mid-year. Included on the list of targets for Davion's campaign were the worlds of Cassius and Udibi, 2 systems that lay within the pre-war borders of the Draconis Combine. It was the first time a concentrated effort had been made to seize Kuritan territory since the war began. Understandably, this side of the front saw much fiercer resistance compared to the liberation campaigns of the past decade, where the locals were only too happy to assist the arriving AFFS. Nevertheless, the planets were secure by year's end. Between October and December, both flanking groups were moving on to secondary targets, while a third task force advanced up the centre, hoping to retake the capital of the Kestrel combat region. In an effort to finally push the Free World's military out of the Alarian province, an assault was made on the fortified stronghold of Crux in November. Going in at a numbers disadvantage was always going to be a risky gamble, and the Lyrans ultimately had to concede defeat in January. They had more success closer to the border, when they took back Alula Borealis in May 2810. The previous December, the Federated Sons had moved to reclaim Demeter from the Chesterton Commonalty, completing the liberation a few months later. The retreating Zurich Lancers were pursued across Algot, Halloran and Uaragon in the early part of 2810, before the AFFS focused instead on Teribert. Their effort to take the planet turned especially nasty when both sides deployed nuclear weapons. The major settlements on the world were caught in the blast, after which the viability of the planet collapsed. Fighting ended in June when both the Capellans and Davion liberators abandoned the system. The Liao Lancers had their chance at payback later that year with a raid of their own against Jaipur. The Davion counteroffensive maintained its momentum into 2810, the 3 task groups landing on 9 different worlds altogether between February and April. Word of the pincer attack the Fed Sons were attempting had made it to those infantry regiments guarding the centre of the line. Fear of an impending encirclement and potentially harsh retributions for their actions earlier in the war caused many to desert their posts. This left the battle mech units unsupported and exposed. McKinnon's raiders undertook deep raids against the Combine throughout the year to keep them off balance. A lack of available transports further hampered Kurita's efforts to blunt the Davion advance. The second, much shorter counteroffensive concluded in December. Paul Davion had planned to take a pause here to regroup, but reports from the front suggested that the Draconis Combine mustered soldiery were finally forming a defensive line ahead. The longer he waited, the better prepared Kurita would be once the fighting resumed. He therefore hurried to move up reinforcements and supplies to begin the third counteroffensive ahead of schedule, early in the new year. Archon Richard Steiner had run out of patience with his ineffectual military leadership. One of the few units to achieve success for the Commonwealth had been the Stealth's Mercenary Regiment. In recent years, they had helped make possible, either through direct assault or supporting raids, the capture of 2 planets within the Dieron military district. For that reason, the Archon made the decision to nationalise the unit in 2810. At great cost, he bought out the entire regiment. Colonel Hempstead was paid a handsome fee to sign on with the LCAF, and given greater authority to command operations on the ground. As part of the deal, the Stealths were granted a period of rest and recreation, far away from the Kuritan front. In December, the Lyran Commonwealth made another attempt to retake Marsal. Despite a relative parity in the numbers, the Bolan defenders were able to hold their ground and force the LCAF to withdraw in the new year, handing the Archon his second defeat in successive years. In an effort to relieve the pressure on those stranded units, the Captain General decided to launch a diversionary campaign on the extreme end of the border at Paulsbo. If the attack here proved successful, Thaddeus Marik hoped to link up with the Crux from both sides, cutting off a large chunk of the Alarian province. They made landfall in early 2811, expecting minimal resistance, but they found the fully recuperated stealths and a strong aerospace presence. A detachment of fighters swept in on the recharging jump ships and destroyed them in seconds, stranding the Atrian Dragoons on world. The Lyrans now used their complete air superiority to hunt down and wipe out the entire regiment. With his campaign on Paulsbo brought to a sudden and ignominious end in March, the Captain General reluctantly accepted the fact that the Bolan Thumb was lost. He dispatched messages to the last of the defenders, informing them of his decision. The subtext of his missive was clear. He expected them to fight to the last. While the decision to move the stealths over to Paulsbo proved extremely fortuitous, some even speculate the LIC was aware of Thaddeus's plans and the Archon's offer of R&R was a ruse, it unfortunately came at the cost of further losses on the Kuritan front. In the past few years, the Draconis Combine had taken 4 systems from the Tamar Pact, getting dangerously close to their capital. If the Federated Sons had learned anything from their near destruction, it was that the division of their perimeter marches into combat regions had contributed significantly to the way in which the DCMS had rolled over them earlier in the war. Because they were cross-sections of the march, if the Kuritans could capture the capital and eliminate the leadership, they had effectively cleared a path straight through to the Crucis March. It was very challenging for the neighbouring combat regions to support them, or manoeuvre forces around in front of the advance. For that reason, Paul Davion came up with the concept of polymorphous defence zones. The Capellan and Draconis marches would be redistricted into irregular but interlinked areas that would hopefully prevent a similar collapse in the future. At the conclusion of the Second Davion counteroffensive, the First Prince dispatched a small force to Marik in December. This would be the final strike Paul planned to make against the Capellan Confederation, as most of his energy went into preparing for the next wave of attacks against the Draconis Combine. In March, the planet was his, and he began the third and final counteroffensive of the war. The goal was to push the Draconis Combine all the way back to their pre-war borders and establish a new defensive line. Once again, the AFFS approached from 2 directions, skirting along the edge of their old border from the Spinward end, while the main advance pushed deep into the former Clovis combat region. As anticipated, the DCMS had fortified the region substantially. They no longer displayed the same shell-shocked behaviour as they had in the aftermath of the Kintari massacre. They faced particularly stubborn resistance on Harrow's Sun. Regiments from the Combine interior had also been redeployed to the front. This was made possible in part through the actions of Amphigean Agriculture Incorporated, who in 2811 formed a security group to protect their assets and any supporting industries, thus freeing up the mustered soldiery and garrison to move elsewhere. Early in 2811, Ilsa Liao and her Mashkarovka began an audacious operation that they hoped would give them an edge over their competitors. They began to approach ComStar technicians in the hope of winning them over to the Confederation. With their expertise, they could train their own loyal workforce and move to take control of the HPGs within their realm. If successful, they could avoid paying ComStar the substantial fees they charged on all military communiques. Things escalated around March-April time, when Mashkarovka agents posing as a terrorist group attempted to seize the hyperpulse station on Nanking, but remarkably, the attack was thwarted by the chief administrator and their staff, who ambushed them inside the facility. ComStar uncovered the identity of the terrorists soon after, and in May, the First Circuit agreed to form a covert security force in response, ROM. Training was to take place at the reactivated Sandhurst Military Academy, site of some of the most intense fighting during the Battle for Terra. At the Terran end of the Capellan Confederation lay the former hegemony world of Brownsville. As a system of die-hard Amaris loyalists, they had received precious little in way of support from Alexander Kerensky after his liberation, and the world had fallen on hard times. This was a hardship partly of their own making, as their fervent commitments to the Emperor had led them to detonate nuclear warheads among their own industrial centres in order to prevent them from falling into SLDF hands. They had at least evacuated the complexes ahead of time, a courtesy rarely afforded by retreating AEAF forces. In one of the very few exceptions to the purge that followed the collapse of the Empire, the planetary government had retained its power, much to the consternation of people like Kerensky, and had tried for a time to maintain their independence. Witnessing the fate of Ingolsmund led them to finally submit before House Liao when they threatened a similar scouring in 2789. The decades-long process of rebuilding was finally coming to a conclusion in the early 29th century. What perhaps was not understood was that their reduced industrial output had allowed them to skirt under the radar in the earlier phase of the war. But now, with a functioning and relatively advanced industrial base, covetous neighbours were starting to look their way. In 2811, the Free Worlds League decided that the people of Brownsville would be better off under the protection of the Captain General. A force was dispatched to take control of what appeared to be a relatively undefended world. But the Brownsville militia were all veterans of the Civil War, their inexperienced younger generation siphoned off into the ranks of the CCAF. They put up unexpected resistance that the Marik forces could not contend with. It was a humiliation that the invaders were not prepared to leave unanswered. As they departed, a civilian freighter approached the system, going unnoticed by those on planet. As it moved into orbit, it unleashed a cargo of strategic weapons that obliterated the cities of Brownsville, killing more than 100 million civilians. The nuclear winter that followed was so severe that the death toll would reach 250 million within the next 2 years, almost half of the planet's population, and that number had doubled by war's end. The few million survivors would all succumb to the planet's poisoned atmosphere within the next few decades. 2811 saw the final battles for what was once the Bolan Thumb. Earlier in the year, 4 LCAF regiments descended on a crux for the second time. The defenders were still heavily damaged from the prior attack, and the Captain General had not been willing to resupply them. The Marik militia lifted off early on, leaving the Bolan defenders to hold out as long as they could. The final holdouts were destroyed in May. Another 4 regiments landed on Marsal in November. Here, they faced off with the very last of the Bolan defenders. Fanaticized by Marik propaganda, they gave their lives for a hopeless cause, dragging the battle out for 4 months before they fell. Over the winter, the Federated Sons succeeded in taking 3 more worlds from House Kurita. One of their targets was the planet Megihi, part of the Draconis Combine since the colony was first founded, where they destroyed the Galladan regulars and garrison. With the capture of Tishomingo, the pre-war Fairfax combat region was completely liberated. The next wave began in April, securing another 3 systems over the next 7 months, but only after fierce fighting on New Iverson. This was somewhat offset by the complete absence of the DCMS on Dobson. By this point, it was clear to Coordinator Jinjiro that Paul Davion was trying to isolate the capitals of Dahar and Robinson, the command and control hubs for the mustered soldiery deployed within the occupied territory. 2812 was a rough year for the Lyran Commonwealth. At the same time as they were hunting down the last of the Bolan defenders in February, the Draconis Combine attacked Caldria and Dove with an overwhelming force of light battle mechs. Moving too quickly for conventional weapons, the garrison commanders attempted to use nuclear warheads to stop them. The DCMS retaliated with chemical weapons on Dove, rendering the world inhospitable. The last of the civilian population would either evacuate off-world or die within the next 3 years. Around this time, the newly formed ROM were beginning their first operations within the Capellan Confederation. Relations between the two were frayed by the attempt at seizing an HPG the previous year. Both were looking to get retribution. ROM discovered that the Mashkarovka were plotting to assassinate the chief administrator of the Bryant HPG, a member of ComStar's first SUCKit. After foiling their plans, the first major victory for the nascent covert ops group, Ilsa Liao ordered the Mashkarovka to cease any attempts at subverting ComStar control. The Chancellor had far greater ambitions at this time. Early in the year, a diversionary attack was launched by Blanford's Grenadiers on the planet Sirius. Though they succeeded in destroying the mercenaries in garrison, they did not try to hold on to the planet. Their objective was simply to misdirect the Federated Suns into thinking that Liao was focused on the Free World's border. A Capellan task force appeared above Chesterton in May. They faced only minimal resistance as they entered atmosphere. The 4 regiments touched down near various objectives that they hoped would finally bring the long-contested world under their control. Unfortunately for Liao, days before they departed the Confederation, an MWIO operative embedded within the Mashkarovka alerted Davion to their intended target, giving the AWFS just enough time to relocate a few regiments of their own to the planet ahead of the invasion. They laid low until the SEACAF made landfall, striking only as they began to emerge from their dropships. Unable to form a defensive line, the Capellans took heavy damage in these opening moments. Just 3 days into the campaign, the Capellan charges had been destroyed, and 7 other battalions had been ravaged by the defending garrison. The Liao commander had no choice but to call a retreat, leaving with their tail tucked between their legs. Within the Lyran Commonwealth, the declining numbers of available jump ships were causing ever greater suffering on worlds that relied on those vital food shipments to survive. Several systems were in the midst of terrible famines, contributing to the abhorrent death toll of the First Succession War as much as the use of WMDs on the front lines. In June, the Speaker of the Assembly officially disbanded the Estates General on account of how few of the planetary rulers were able to make it to Tharkad. On August 3rd, the Archon was holding court when he was approached by Landgrave Richard Perkins of Hegel. His planet was in the midst of a plague epidemic, and the vital medical supplies were not reaching the system on account of the military requisitioning all available jump ships. Among the many dead were Perkins's family. As the noble approached within 4 meters of Steiner, he drew a laser pistol and went to shoot the Archon, when one of the Griffin battlemechs standing guard slammed his fist down between the two. Perkins was taken captive, and the LIC quickly discovered that he had been paid handsomely by their rivals in SAFE to kill Richard Steiner. Thankfully, the attempt on his life had failed. Though the Lyran noble was sentenced to death, the Archon commuted his sentence to life imprisonment, understanding how the tragedy on Hegel had forced Perkins's hand. The final actions of 2812 came in November, when a Free World's force landed on Alula Borealis, taking control of the system by year's end. The Lyran Intelligence Corps reported that this was likely the last move the Captain General would make for some time now, having thoroughly exhausted his forces in the region. With a brief reprieve, the Archon made the decision to disband his newly acquired elite regiment, the Stealths, and spread their experienced MechWarriors across the Commonwealth's military academies. He hoped that they would inspire a new wave of more capable commanders to enter service within the LCAF, and hopefully rejuvenate his stagnant and uninspired officer corps. In late 2812, the AWFS landed on another trio of planets in their continued campaign to reclaim the entirety of the Federated Suns. They faced a determined defense from the garrison on Nouveau-Toulouse, but otherwise the systems were secure early in the new year. In March, troops were dispatched to the next wave of targets, capturing the remaining 6 systems by year's end. Those sent to Fairfield were particularly fortunate, as they discovered the DCMS had packed up and left long before their arrival. The Kurita bulge had now been compressed down to its narrowest since the first week of Jinjiro's invasion. Next up were the primary targets of the counteroffensive, Dahar and Robinson. The Lyran Intelligence Corps had reported that the Free World's border was likely to be quiet for the foreseeable future, as House Marik was dealing with the same supply and transport problems as the Commonwealth. What they failed to account for was that House Cameron Jones had several well-rested provincial regiments deep within the Principality of Regulus that could be moved up to the front line. Bella 1 was a world that had already changed hands twice during the First Succession War, but even still, it came as a shock when the FWLM arrived in April. The defenders were alerted to their presence as soon as they appeared at the zenith. Unsecured radio chatter revealed they faced 4 enemy regiments, a force they could not hope to hold off. Faced with the loss of his garrison, Colonel Hamlin decided to call for an immediate retreat off-world. the Lyran aerospace fighters were ordered not to engage the incoming dropships so that they would be at maximum strength to escort the Lyran regulars out to their jump ships. The Regulan Hussars were the first down and immediately moved to prevent the withdrawal. A frenzied battle took place at the spaceport, but Hamlin was able to lift off with most of his forces. It was only when they were halfway to the system's nadir that they realised that the Freeworld's guards hadn't even arrived in system yet. Colonel Magane's reckless attack had been a ruse to make them think that he was outnumbered. The Lyran commander did not remain a colonel for much longer once High Command discovered he'd surrendered Bella so easily. Not everything was going the League's way in 2813, however. In the spring, ComStar technician Emma Gomez at the Carver 5 base was discovered to be a safe operative feeding information back to the Captain General on Blake's activities. Their scheme was quickly foiled by Rom, and in the aftermath, Blake decided to expand the organization's internal security force to prevent any further leaks. The only other activity in 2813 occurred within the Tikhonov commonality. Paul Davion had hoped the loss at Chesterton would have dissuaded the Chancellor from making any other moves in the region, but the opportunistic Ilsa Liao knew that the First Prince was too busy with his counteroffensive to maintain much of a garrison in the region. Landing on Marik in July, they took the world for the Confederation 2 months later. They also repulsed combine assaults on Bryant, Epsilon Indy, and Ingris. Throughout the First Succession War, ComStar under Jerome Blake was content to sit back and play a largely pacifist role in maintaining the Innisphere's HBG network. Ensuring their continued monopoly over all interstellar communications was their sole aim at this point in their history. They did what they could to avoid becoming targets for the rampaging successor states by decommissioning their battlemech factories and naval yards and secretly mothballing their hidden warship fleet. Operation Silver Shield was the last overt military action that they took back at the beginning of the conflict, and there are very few other incidents in which their involvement is only suspected. Lauren Hayes, who had led her SLDF forces to victory on Terra, both alongside Kerensky and under the orders of the First Circuit, would retire within the next 2 years. The ComStar expeditionary divisions would themselves be disbanded, and their assets put into long-term storage beneath their headquarters at the Hilton Head HBG on Terra. But this was not the end of ComStar's involvement in the Succession Wars. The past few years had seen the emergence and fast growth of a new power within their ranks, ROM. This shadowy internal security force, answerable solely to the Prime Administrator, would soon become a secret intelligence agency to rival any belonging to the Great Houses. The First Succession War would soon enter its final phase. Little did humanity know that one of the greatest opponents of peace had come into being, and was now spreading like a virus across the Innisphere. Thank you very much for watching, guys. I hope you enjoyed today's episode. It's been a little while since the last one. I know I needed a little bit of a break. Putting out a chapter every single week was just taking so much of my time that after 2 months I couldn't keep it going any longer. But I've returned to the project now, refreshed, and with enough drive, I think, to see it through to the end. This was the last of the longer chapters, coming in at 30 minutes. I'm pretty sure the next 3 will all be in the 15 to 20 minute mark. Next week, we're going to be pressing pause on events on the Innisphere and taking the time to look at events out in the Periphery. We've barely mentioned them at all, apart from a couple of incidents of the Lyran Commonwealth playing out in the ruins of the Rimwell's Republic, but they've had their own trials and tribulations going on, especially around this point where we're ending the episode. At the end of 2813, the one and only significant conflict to take place between 2 of the Periphery nations, the Magistracy of Canopus and the Taurian Concordat, is about to kick off. It's a short-lived affair, and we're going to be going over it next time. Truth be told, the Periphery plays such a minor part in the Succession Wars that I don't think we'll be hearing from them again for a long while now. I plan to do a video at some point on the history of the Oregon Reach, how House Arano came to lead the coalition, and everything that leads up into the beginning of the HBS BattleTech game. Events there don't really start to happen until after the end of the Second Succession War, so it's going to be a little while yet, but I think that'll be the next time we look at the Periphery in any great detail. Right now they're just trying to keep their heads down and avoid the nukes that are flying back and forth. If you've enjoyed today's video, please leave me a comment, let me know what you thought, and you can support the channel by leaving a like or even sharing it around with other people who you think might enjoy it. If you want to go further, I do have a Patreon linked in the description. There you can find some other material I've done for this project, like audio-only versions of prior series, and also links to the maps and things of that nature. I plan to be back next weekend with that shorter Periphery episode. I think it's only going to be about 15 minutes. And after that, there's only going to be 2 more to go. I think we're going to cover everything up to the final year in the penultimate episode, and then wrap things up in 28-21 to conclude this series. Thank you very much for watching. Thank you for your patience with getting this chapter out. Hopefully we can get the final 3 parts in the next 3 weeks. Cheers guys, take care.